we're almost coming on to this next stage of the industry. And
so the CIA got so concerned because America's whole defense industry depended on satellites powered by photovoltaics.
We set ourselves a goal of eliminating the production of 1 billion pounds of CO2 because we could see what was happening with global warming.
The hope of being able to go and have self-sufficiency and be able to go and plug into this decentralized financial system that no single government organization or entity can control or shut down. So first off, I would like to say a huge thank you guys for coming onto the podcast to talk about the solar industry. Out of everyone out there in the industry, I think that you two are best suited to really tackle this discussion, talk about your backgrounds and really how you've seen the industry evolve. Just because, just like in Bitcoin mining, crypto mining, we're dealing with a very early industry. You guys were there from the very early days of solar, and it'd be really fascinating to hear your guys' background in your work in the solar industry, but also how you think it's going to evolve over time. So without further ado, I'll pass it off to you, Mr. Schaeffer, and you can talk a little bit about your background and your experience in the industry.
Well, thanks for inviting me on the show, Will. It's a pleasure to speak to some of the miners out there. I guess I got my start in solar just to predate a little bit. I graduated from UC Berkeley in 1971, moved to a commune up in Mendocino County in 72, came up for Labor Day weekend, actually. That would have been 49 years ago, and ended up staying for 8 years. It was quite a place. It was everyone's ideal dream of living in the woods, completely off the grid. There was nothing there. There were no houses. There were no roads. There were no gardens. There was no water. There was no indoor plumbing. There was obviously no internet. No Google or Facebook. So at the time, over
Facebook.
Over the 5 years,
Facebook wasn't listening in on the conversations.
No. There was better security back then. So it became clear soon that with the kids that were growing up on this commune, we were using kerosene lamps and propane lamps, and there was no indoor plumbing or refrigeration. So we were learning as we went along what life was like without energy. I started early times around, 73, 74, building a Savonius rotor out of 55-gallon drums and spinning around to try to create energy through the wind. Soon after that, I got a job at the computer center in Ukiah, where I was running, the tax rolls and the welfare checks and all of the accounts payable for the county of Mendocino. So I was driving 37 miles a day from kind of a 19th century commune to the height of 20th century computers. But back then, a room about 50 by 50 held about 40 megabytes of storage there. It was the early days of computing. It was all done with punch cards and magnetic tapes. So I would drive 45 minutes to work every day in my little Volkswagen, where I had a redwood stump as a seat. No one cared about seat belts back then. And I soon discovered that this long drive, I could charge a battery in my car. So I hooked up a spare battery in my trunk with a battery isolator. So every time I drive to work, my little Volkswagen Bug, became a battery charger. Soon after that, I found some 12-volt light bulbs on a shelf in a little hardware store in Ukiah gathering dust. Came home and I plugged those in to a electrical fixture, ran them off my little Volkswagen battery, and lo and behold, I had electricity running in my little cabin in the woods. And it was kind of a Luddite community where people did not take kindly to electricity. So these were hippies from the 60s and 70s that didn't want to see much advancement. They wanted to go off the grid. They wanted to get away from, the quote man and the technology that was coming aboard in the late 20th century. So soon after that, I found a 12-volt television set up at an RV store in Laytonville, and kind of snuck it home under the blankets of the Volkswagen. Brought it up to my cabin, and we plugged that into the battery, the 12-volt battery that we were charging on the Volkswagen. And here it was Saturday night. We had John Belushi and Gilda Radner and Dan Aykroyd on Saturday Night Live. So I would gradually sneak up one or two of the fellow communards up to my house, and we'd watch Saturday Night Live, and it was like the highlight of our lives, because here we'd been, we'd gone without. We were complete ascetics for a long time, and here we had culture. But of course, some of the leaders of the commune didn't like this, and we were heretics, and Anyway, it got us to the idea that electricity was something nice to have in the woods, but not very easy to have. The Savonius rotor did not work very well. It was nice to have a little bit of electricity so the kids could do their homework at night. So shortly after that, as I drive back and forth to Ukiah every day in this Volkswagen, people would ask me, could you pick me up some chicken manure, pick me up some batteries, pick me up some blood meal? And interestingly, at the same time, people were beginning to grow marijuana in the woods of Mendocino County. And it started to get a reputation for pot growing. So I would bring all the stuff back to the commune. Pretty soon I realized, wouldn't it be nice if people could buy all this at one store instead of, I would go down 15 stores down State Street in Ukiah. One would have the kerosene lamp chimneys, one would have the fertilizers, one would have the drip irrigation. So soon after that, in June of 78, I opened up a store with a partner called Real Goods. And the banks called it a New Age General Store. It was a store that we opened in Willits, and it was an instant success. We sold wood stoves, and we sold men's and women's clothing, and we sold all kinds of fertilizers and drip irrigation systems and organic, before there was organic, just kind of a rounding of products for everybody living the off-the-grid lifestyle in the woods. So we did like $1 million in the first year in sales. People were flocking out of the hills from Nevada City and Grass Valley and Humboldt County and the Bay Area because we were the only store of its kind. And a couple months after we opened up, this guy drove up in a Porsche, and in the back of his Porsche, he had these 9-volt photovoltaic panels. And these were the first I'd ever seen. We had a Berkeley physicist working as a retail clerk in the store, and he took these out in the parking lot. This guy left a couple samples, and lo and behold, we had photovoltaic electricity in the parking lot of the Real Goods store. And, we were just blown away. I mean, electricity from the sun. This was completely revolutionary. How could this happen? And the price on them at the time was about $100 a watt. This was a 9-watt panel, but it worked. So I wanted to get back to emphasizing that the marijuana, the cannabis industry co-evolved with the solar industry, because the only people that could afford these $100 a watt PV panels were the pot growers in the hills. So they actually supported the industry, got it going. And at the same time, the photovoltaic industry supported the pot growers in their off-the-grid lifestyle because they lived way out in the woods and there was no way they could have electricity without solar. They didn't want diesel generators making huge noise and smells in the woods. So these two industries evolved side by side. So this guy that came up to the store with the 3 solar panels came back a couple of weeks later, and we got 10 of them. Then he came back a month later, and we bought 100 of them, and then we bought 1,000 of them. And these were the very first PVs sold at retail in the United States in 1978. Soon after that, one of my colleagues, David Katz, opened a store in Garberville, and Independent Power, John Hill and Sam Vanderhoff opened a store over in Grass Valley in Nevada City. Joel Davidson opened one in Arkansas. So the industry began to blossom in the very early days. So, little by little, people began to use solar panels out there. And it wasn't because it was the cheapest technology by far. It was because it was the only technology that worked for these people in the woods. So, Real Goods sat there as pretty much us and maybe 4 or 5 other companies in the country as the only company selling PV in America, probably the world as well, for probably close to 30 years. And it just kind of inched along. Not a whole lot was happening. And I could talk for hours on the time between there, but around 1990, we decided to do a direct public offering. And this was the very first direct public offering where people could invest in the company, our customers, rather than through investment bankers. So it was kind of an off-the-grid financing scheme, before hedge funds and all that. So we raised $10 million. We decided to buy a desolated site in Hopland, California, which was 20, 30 miles south of Willits, where we could build a model of sustainability, of regeneration, where everything was built right the first time. So we took what was essentially a brownfield, an old vineyard from the old agricultural days, and we created an environmental paradise, ecological paradise on the site, where the whole place was powered by solar, powered by wind, and all of the driveways were built with gravel instead of petroleum laden asphalt, and the garden was built all of plants that were either edible or useful. The buildings were built all of recycled materials. We had a straw bale, the largest straw bale building in the world, a 6,000 square foot building covered with pneumatically impacted stabilized earth that came from the ground. We built natural buildings out of cob and hemp and mushrooms, grown mushroom structures. And this became kind of the eco paradise, the mecca for environmental mecca for people around the country. But getting back to the solar industry for a minute, there were two major things that happened to revolutionize the industry to get it mass market. I'd say the first was around 1997, where net metering came into play, where up to that point, solar had been in the realm of off-the-grid homesteaders and wasn't at all mainstream. So the utility companies had a monopoly on it. Like our local utility company, Pacific Gas and Electric, you could buy electricity from them for retail, like 8, 10, 15 cents a watt, whatever it was back then. 10 or 15 cents a kilowatt hour. Whereas if you wanted to sell it to them, they could buy it from you at wholesale rates, was maybe 2 or 3 cents a kilowatt hour. So there was an arbitrage, a negative arbitrage, where it didn't make sense to use solar. Well, there was some pressure from some of the utility groups, and Ralph Nader back then used to speak at our festivals, and they finally got in California the first net metering law that said the utility company must pay the independent generator of solar or any other renewable energy source the same amount that they charge them. So all of a sudden, for the first time, solar became somewhat viable. And I think I had either the first or one of the first net metering homes in California at my home in Ukiah. And it was an incredible feeling to be generating that electricity. So 1997, the industry began to creep along a little bit. People were getting into it, and it was becoming a little bit more mainstream, but not really mainstream. Then around 2006, the second revolutionary thing happened, which was the advent of the lease or the power purchase agreement. Back in the 1950s, no one could afford to buy a car because the outlay was so high. People's working paycheck to paycheck just couldn't afford it. So when they came out with the first leases for cars, all of a sudden the car industry, automobile industry, exploded in America. So around the same thing happened in 2006. A little company called Sunrun started coming out with a lease, and then the same time, Solar City, Elon Musk cousins, the Wright brothers, apparently took a bunch of mushrooms at Burning Man and came up with the idea for Solar City, and that was one of the first leasing companies out there. So Real Goods, for the first time, had a real competitor, viable competitor in Sunrun and in Solar City. So all of a sudden, people who could nowhere before afford solar, suddenly the advertising was, you can now get a lease on solar energy, put it on your home, and pay less than you're paying on your normal PG&E bill. So suddenly solar became affordable for the general population, and it exploded. Our company, Real Goods, from 2006 to 2011, we went from one little store in the hills to probably 15, 20 offices around the country, doing like 50 million in annual sales. Everything was exploding. The companies were coming up left and right, Vivint Solar, Solar City. So that was the next big advent of solar that really got it to take off. And the same idea price-wise. I think you've heard of Moore's Law that says for every doubling in production of a technology like solar, there's a 15 to 20% reduction in price. But solar was even stronger than that. You take $100 a watt was that solar panel we had in 1978. It's funny, in my email this morning, one of the first things I opened up was a company in Florida advertising photovoltaics for 20 cents a watt. It's the lowest I've ever seen. So we're going from $100 a watt to 20 cents a watt. That's a 500-time differential in the declination of price. Over 78 to 21 is 43 years, 500 times the declination in price. So solar has really gone mainstream today. And, that's kind of an overview of my background and how Real Goods took solar from nothing to major multi-billion-dollar industry. And I think the way it relates to Bitcoin and Bitcoin crypto mining is that the feeling of independence that we had in the early days of being off the grid. I mean, I still live in an off-grid home, 25 kilowatts of solar, hydroelectric panels. I don't use any fossil fuels at all. I think that feeling that people get is similar to what people have with crypto. They want to be off the financial grid. They want to be off the U.S. Treasury grid. They want to have coins to themselves and not have anyone messing with what they're doing. It's the same kind of rugged individualism that brought solar about in the country. So I think that the two industries have very interesting to see them grow together. They come from the same mindset and the same feeling of fierce independence that humans tend to seek out in this world. So anyway, that's my story.
That's absolutely incredible. And yeah, just hearing you talk through it, it was really incredible to see how much the technology has evolved around solar and how quickly it's been moving since those first panels, $100 a watt, now coming down to 20 cents. I mean, it's really, really incredible to see how quickly the technology has evolved. Would also love to hear your story, John Perlin. We got two Johns on the call, so maybe I'm going to have to go with Mr. Perlin and Mr. Schaeffer for the rest to distinguish between the two. But yeah, would love to hear your background as well and your story around the work that you've done in the industry.
Well, first of all, both John's and my beginnings are the same. We both went to Berkeley, and I lived. I lived in a co-op at Berkeley because I was dirt poor. But that's where our backgrounds diverge. I went to live on a commune too, but it was a more organized commune. It was in Israel, and I was out picking lemon on a teetering, tottering ladder. And I said, shit, I'm just a Jewish bracero, and the migrant is going to come and take me away. So I decided I would become a writer. And then I decided, because English is my best language, better than my Hebrew, I would come back to the USA. And in the USA, I was sort of living a different lifestyle than John was. I was actually living in a farmhouse in Goleta, California, where we paid $5 a month rent. And when it rained, we put up our umbrellas inside. And I worked as a gardener while thinking about writing a book. And suddenly in Santa Barbara, there was this big vote among the Board of Supervisors on, Exxon said the only way to solve the energy crisis is move more fossil fuels, right? And so I asked myself the question, is there an alternative? So I spent a half a year at the city library reading about solar. Then the Board of Supervisors meeting, I presented, and a person heard who was head of the most popular radio station in Santa Barbara said if I wrote up what I said, he would give me all the airtime possible. And I made this 8-page booklet called Solar Energy Fact Sheet. So that was my first, tip my hat into the publishing world. And I sold about, it was like you put, each page, actually it was printed on a mimeograph because there wasn't word processing at the time. And, you roll it hand by hand, each page from a master sheet. Then had a ping pong table, went, page by page, and then went to a print shop and got bound with staples on a machine. And because I got all this airtime, I sold like 100 copies, and I was really excited. And then head of the Santa Barbara City Library read my little solar energy fact sheet, and he really liked it. So he told me to go to an alternative library, a journal, and he said if I'd get it reviewed, then I would sell thousands. It got a real nice review. And so I was selling copies all over the world and randomly going to places where I could stuff them in envelopes. And then at a solar meeting, because of my publication, some folks who grew up in LA at the turn of the century said, they were in their 70s at the time, said, oh, you guys think you're into something new. There was a major solar water heater industry in Southern California between the 1890s and 1930s. So I said, wow, how many people get to write about something that never had never been told before, right? So that began what was called the golden thread of the story of the 2,500 years of solar architecture and technology, which sold over 100,000 copies in the USA and got translated into multi-languages. And so that got me interested. And what John said was really interesting, too, because at the time of publication, there had been only only 700 kilowatts of photovoltaics throughout the world, which is incredible when you think of it. That's just a small installation for a commercial building today. So I got interested in photovoltaics, and I was lucky to fall in to all the pioneers that no one knew about in more, I would say, the straight world. They were like the people who were from Bell Labs who discovered the silicon solar cell, which made John's story possible. But and then also I met the people who helped establish the photovoltaic industry for the Defense Department, where every satellite that went up, was powered by photovoltaics. And so these people became my mentors for my next book called From Space to Earth, The Story of Solar Electricity. So the irony I see is that on one hand, photovoltaics was making the commune life, the life up in the hills of Mendocino County possible, but also on the other hand, making the most highly sophisticated devices for NASA possible. Because without the photovoltaic cell, we could have never had any long-lived satellites. In fact, satellites run the world, and they're photovoltaically powered because the only alternative was the battery. And as we know, if we keep our lights on when the car's in the garage, you have to call AAA the next day. But in space, you couldn't do that, right? And so actually, the birth of photovoltaics was unknown until I did this research, was basically under the guise of the military-industrial complex. And what's really amazing is, for example, I could send you them, is the advertisements by all the major military-industrial companies in the South Bay of Los Angeles in the 1960s, total photovoltaic freaks. So I think it's really interesting the different avenues that John and I both traveled using the same technology. One was back to the land, and the other was up into space. Actually, photovoltaics were so important for America's defense industry. There was a project, it's really incredible, and it's almost like it's crazy, it was called Operation Starfish, where the United States did, have you heard of Starfish?
Yeah, I've heard something about it, but definitely want to hear you talk through it. It's fascinating.
Okay, what Starfish was, there's what's called the Van Allen belt. In outer space, there's this belt of radiation. So what the United States did was it began to test nuclear devices in space, and the end result was knocking out all the power stations in Hawaii, but also knocking out the satellites because the radiation disabled the panels. So the CIA got so concerned because America's whole defense industry depended on satellites powered by photovoltaics. And I think this is interesting. So you have John and the people in Mendocino back to the land, and then in the sky there's the defense industry just as freaky about photovoltaics as your people, right? Mm-hmm. And so what they did, and I actually was able to get through the Freedom of Information Act, the document where the CIA conflab, of all the PV experts in the world, in the United States, to solve the problem of artificial radiation created by Operation Starfish. So the industry is kind of interesting in that it had two different origins. One at the highest level of the straight world, right? And the other, the back to the land. In fact, the first people to bring solar terrestrially was a company, Exxon subsidiary, called Solar Power Corporation. And the first people to really use solar on Earth where they were used platforms, rigs, offshore rigs. So it's really crazy, almost schizophrenic, multi-origin photovoltaics, but we're coming to the same endpoint where photovoltaics is now the cheapest form of electricity in the world, and we're seeing like at the end point, or maybe you might say the great beginning of the solar revolution, where solar electricity and solar energy will once again be the major source of power, as it was like thousands of years ago with the Greeks and the Romans and the Chinese. We have these multiple solar revolutions. One was in architecture, in solar water heating, and now 3 is in the direct use of the sun for electricity. And I think it's incredible to think that in 1977 there were only 700 kWs of solar, and now I think there's almost a trillion watts of PV installed.
Yeah. And actually, just going off of that, it's very clear that we're seeing this evolution, and you're talking about how we're almost coming on to this next stage of the industry. And right now, people who don't have the background and understanding of where the solar industry was and where it's going, they haven't seen all these trends that you guys have really been on the front lines for. So with that said, I guess the next question would be, what role do you see solar energy playing today in society, and what do you see that role being moving forward into the future?
The major source, according to the International Energy Agency, which for the longest time has been really skeptical about photovoltaics. I see photovoltaics as becoming the major source of the electricity in an electrified world. I mean, the prognostications are that PV and wind will be the major sources of energy. They're already the cheapest forms of energy. Actually, at this moment, then nuclear is about 2 to 4 times as expensive as PV. And also, gas-powered generators are like, I think it's about 1.5 times more expensive than a PV installation. Oh, and also keep in mind the concurrent development batteries. You have these 2 revolutions going on. Is the steep decrease in price of batteries and the steep decrease of price of photovoltaics. And so together, you have a 24/7 clean solution.
Right. Another fact, we did a study once for one of our source books where we looked at how big of an area of PV would it take to power the entire United States. We came up with an 87 by 87 miles in the Nevada desert could generate enough PV to power the entire electric grid in the United States. And the last time I looked, I've been kind of out of it for a few years, but the last time I looked, we were sitting at 1 or 1.5% of our power coming from PV. And you know where we're at now, John, 2 or 3% or something like that, but it's got a long way to go.
I think the next few years it's 10%.
10%, yeah.
That's what the forecast is. Like they expect I'd have to get my notes out, and it's in my computer. But by 2030, I think it is, the expectation is to be at maybe 15-20%.
One of the interesting things that John was talking about was energy storage, and I know there's a big misconception about solar out there that by putting solar panels on your house, if the grid goes down, you're going to have light in the neighborhood when everyone else is out. But that's not true. Most people that have grid intertie systems, if the power goes out, they lose their power as well. But and the problem up to this point is the expense of battery technology. As John was saying, like I have my house here, I have 25 kilowatt solar system, but I also have 75 kilowatt hours of battery storage. So I have no grid tie whatsoever. Right now, and the advancements are being made in China, but these lithium iron phosphate batteries, they call them LiFePO, LiFePO, lithium iron phosphate. Anyway, the price on those is coming down pretty drastically. So if people can start to afford that kind of storage in their homes, it's going to eliminate one of the big barriers to entry for solar so that people can be continually off the grid. And I think that's going to probably take 5 or 10 years to get down to be affordable, but that's on the way too.
Well, I think what's interesting is the societal bifurcation on solar in the United States with the quote, what is called again, the culture wars. Photovoltaics became identified with anti-Vietnam people and hippies, and was considered like a really just a goofy power source, even military was dependent on photovoltaics versus the situation in Germany where it became part of the national scheme to, install PV, and that oiled the PV panels being built primarily in China because they weren't bound by America's cultural problem, and they just saw a lot of money to be made.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a really interesting situation where the Germans, since the 90s, really believed in the problem of climate change. But, it was a shared value by everyone in the society, while in our society it became a political football.
Mm-hmm.
And so in 2004, you had it's called the Red-Green Coalition between the Socialists and the Greens, and they established the first major residential photovoltaic experience in the world. And the Chinese said, well, look at all these people, they need photovoltaics. We'll build, and that's what's happened.
Yeah, it's interesting, the crossover between, in the early days, photovoltaics were in the realm of the hippies and the progressives. And then around, the late 90s, we started getting a lot of calling for photovoltaics from survivalists in Utah, where we'd have someone call up. They'd call up on a Wednesday and they'd say, can you deliver us 3,000 watts of solar by Friday? We said, well, that'll be overnight FedEx. It'll cost just $800 in freight. And they said, well, it doesn't matter because the Armageddon, the end of the world, is happening on Saturday. So we got to have these things. All of a sudden that's happened. But it's interesting what John was saying too with the German model. It takes me back to the 90s when we first learned about global warming. And in Hopland at the Solar Living Center, we set ourselves a goal of eliminating the production of 1 billion pounds of CO2 because we could see what was happening with global warming. We made a model of California with a topo map underneath it and water that would flood up to it. And then we had a little valve people could turn. We said, if we don't do anything about removing CO2 from the atmosphere, if we don't get in more into renewable energy, we turn on this faucet and the water would come up and go over the Sacramento Valley and, flood the Bay Area. And we had this 1 billion pound goal where we would measure people buying compact fluorescents and photovoltaics to see how much energy they could save. But I just dug out one of these editorials the other day, and it said, if we don't do something about global warming by the year 2020, and this was 1991, I think. So if we don't do something in 30 years, we're going to have major catastrophes like, hurricanes and fires and tornadoes and floods. And it was just so depressing to read that and realize how completely short-sighted our species is. That can't think more than a year ahead and wonder why it is that it got political, that all of a sudden it's the Republicans that are in denial and the Democrats that aren't. But generally as a species, it doesn't matter what the political affiliation was, we're just, taking ourselves down this horrible path of destruction, and not to get political, but in the middle of losing our democracy and losing our women's rights with Roe versus Wade. But I'm digressing here into depression. So
it sounds like there are a lot of benefits coming forward right now with solar and the cost coming down and everything else. It now becoming the cheapest source of power. So what are the limitations that you guys see today that are really stopping it from going fully mainstream? Are there certain particular things about it that are really preventing a faster shift?
Well, I would say it's just the same old. I was watching a meeting on fossil fuel industry trying to sell what they call blue hydrogen, and it's sort of like a fourth grader trying to fudge on what they previously said to not to fail their class. Because it turns out and the whole idea of carbon storage, you have these that are very powerful that are trying to continue breathing, right, as by basically bold-faced lying.
I can't really think of any barriers other than inertia. Just that it takes our species so long to come to its senses. The financial barriers are gone with financing, and the environmental barriers are gone. There used to be fossil fuel industry used to talk about how it would take 10 years of embodied energy to create one photovoltaic panel, but that was disproven. to certainly have enough sand in the world to make the silicon that's needed, so there's no shortage of materials. Prices down to can't get much lower than what it is now. So I can't really think of any great barriers to adoption. It's just the slowness of people to act.
Well, I would say too, and that's one thing should be mentioned. Not only has the price gone down, but the efficiency has dramatically gone up.
Yeah, back in the 50s, people used to think, or in the 70s, people used to think that 6% was about all we were going to be able to get out of PVs. And what are we up to now? 30-35% in the average now, John?
Well, actually, we're at about 24% efficient, but getting up to like 26%. And then they're talking about tandem silicon with what's called perovskite, is it? Together, getting beyond the theoretical limitations of a single band gap cell, and it's just amazing. But what's really interesting too is you have photovoltaics that were installed in 1980, and they're still doing quite well.
Yeah, my house is like a museum. I've got ones from 1980, I've got ones from 1995, ones from 2018, all working side by side and generating it out. But it's interesting. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to ask you, who made the first modules that you talked about being delivered to your store?
Arco Solar.
So Arco Solar, those were the first?
Yeah, those were the first ones that we had. There was a company in LA called the William Lamb Company, and they got them from the space industry, I think from NASA. And that's where we bought the first ones that were used, that were made by Arco. And then Arco was the only game in town, and then they sold out to Siemens, and then Exxon came through, and Solar Power Corporation, Midway Solar doing concentrators, and they all started getting into it.
Yeah, so basically, as I see it, we have another solar revolution. Because from my research in the history of solar, there's been these multiple solar revolutions where solar dominated the society in architecture with the ancient Chinese, then the classical Greeks, then the Romans, and then the Chinese also. Solar monopolized the fire lighting. You focus a mirror on tinder, and then you get a little fire, and then it would produce the the fuel for the meal. And then this is kind of interesting. And then in the Renaissance, it became the main way of concentrating solar. Became the way people soldered, worked in the metal industry. And then you had the solar water heater industry, which dominated first in Southern California, then in Florida, then in Cyprus and Israel, and then in China. So we have different aspects, different. We have both solar photovoltaics, and we have solar thermal, which people tend to forget.
So one of the big themes just within Bitcoin is this idea of self-sufficiency, the idea of decentralization, and hearing you guys talk through solar, it seems like there are certain parallels between both industries. But from your point of view, how are you guys looking at the Bitcoin mining industry and Bitcoin as an asset class?
I don't really think I know enough about it to have much intelligence, but it's like I was saying earlier, I think it comes from the same mindset of independence and not wanting to be under the scrutiny of either the power companies or the U.S. Treasury or the U.S. financial industry or the government. People want to be individuals, and crypto does that as well as solar does that.
Well, see, I think that's more of an American mindset than a world mindset. And also, what's quite ironic, once again, I love ironies, is that right now the major generator of solar power are the large centralized installations.
Will, I'm curious to ask you the question about, one of the biggest barriers to people accepting the crypto industry is the supposed use, rampant use of renewable energy, or not use of renewable energy, but the use of fossil fuels and in bit mining technology. So, and wasn't that the reason why, one of the reasons why Elon Musk got out of it was because he claimed that it was so inefficient? So is that really true, or is that just a nasty rumor? And is this something that photovoltaics can rescue?
Yeah, well, first off, I think that question right there is one of the most important questions to be asking right now. And the way that I like to go about speaking about it is really, what's the goal of what we're trying to accomplish? And if the goal is we want to move also off of a fossil fuel dependent society into a renewable driven society, then what you have to do is you have to find a way to meet the energy demands of society through renewable energy sources, and not need fossil fuels. And tying this all back to Bitcoin mining, the way that we see it is that this is one of the greenest industries out there. And the reason for that is because the way that it operates in the energy sector is it makes it easier for renewable projects to get up and running. And why is this? Why is Bitcoin mining one of the secrets to getting renewable energy projects funded? It's because Bitcoin miners are a consumer of power that can be located anywhere around the world at the source and consume the power of last resort, or the excess power, or the power that may need to be curtailed, and use that to mine Bitcoin. And when you look at Bitcoin at its core, it really is a decentralized monetary network. It's a network that, as you mentioned, any single person around the world with an internet connection can plug into. So for the marginal energy in society, or the wasted and excess energy in society, you're powering a decentralized network that gives people around the world hope at economic self-preservation. The hope of being able to go and have self-sufficiency, not be reliant on the institutions of your state, especially if you're in a corrupt state, and be able to go and plug into this decentralized financial system that no single government, organization, or entity can control or shut down. And I think that that's one of the most powerful and important things about Bitcoin, is that it's decentralized. It's not like a monetary system, a fiat currency driven monetary system where a government can go and print more of the currency. If I'm providing someone a service, or any of you guys are providing someone a service, you're being paid in monetary energy, basically the work that someone else had to go and do to get that money, and they're paying you for that work. And you're providing value in the open market. When we go and we click the print button on money, that isn't work that was earned through society, through the monetary energy and the work that I performed. That is money and energy that's being printed and devaluing all the other holders of that currency, devaluing the amount of work and contribution they've contributed. So over time, you're fighting an uphill battle if you're holding on to a currency that's being printed away. And I think that a clear example of what we've seen is what has happened in Venezuela. It's happened in Cyprus. It's happened in many different countries where currencies fail, and you see a tremendous amount of harm done to the citizens of that country. They don't have enough, they don't have the capability to pay for a livable standard of living, because they're living in a regime where their currency's been devalued and their wealth has been evaporated overnight. Having the decentralized monetary network powered by renewable energy, powered by the energy of last resort, the marginal cost energy to society, to support a system that gives 7 billion people around the world hope to have financial services and the ability to preserve their wealth. I think that that's what's really important. And the last piece on that front with the energy consumption, and going back to what happened with Musk and everything else, is I think it was actually a good thing that question was brought forth, and someone as highly profiled as Musk was speaking about it, is because what ended up happening was it got the industry to come together and really start looking into what is the power mix powering the Bitcoin network, what's the renewable energy makeup. And what we really found is that it really is as green of an industry as you can get. I mean, if I look at this shirt or you look at any of the things that we use on a day-to-day basis, we don't look at anything else under the same light that we're looking at Bitcoin. Because if we go and let's say you plug in your Tesla, are we asking what the energy mix of the grid that powered your Tesla is using? Because the answer to that is it's primarily fossil fuels that's powering your Tesla. And so that's one of the things where it's having an honest discussion about, okay, what's the goal with renewable energy? What's the goal of the role of energy in our society? And how do we want to look at energy consumption and energy use? And particularly, how do we want to evaluate the use of Bitcoin's energy consumption? So there's a long answer.
Can you explain how the mining process works and why it uses so much energy? What does it actually do? I'm unclear.
Yeah, the mining process for Bitcoin in particular, what we're talking about, it stands for proof of work. And so the whole idea of proof of work in Bitcoin mining is you have all of these different miners around the world that are like nodes in the network, and they're trying to uphold the protocol for Bitcoin. You can think of the protocol as like the rules governing Bitcoin and making sure that transactions are going through fairly. No single person can print more Bitcoin. There's going to be 21 million. So basically all the different miners are processing data, processing transactions, and providing security for the Bitcoin network to uphold the proper rules of the Bitcoin network and the ledger. And the genius of the system, and the reason why you see the energy consumption that you do have in Bitcoin, because there's no doubt it consumes a solid amount of energy, that's tying the real world monetary value to real world energy, which is something that I think inherently you need within sound money. Because in sound money, you want to tie that to work, and ideally want to tie it to real world energy rather than the decision of a small group of people. And so the reason being, again, that mining is so important and the system is so important is because for the first time ever in human history, we found a way to fix the money and have that money tied to real world energy and be base layer one money that no single person can corrupt or devalue.
So what happened last night that apparently dropped the price 10 or 15% was that somehow the U.S. Department of Justice was able to hack out, I don't know, $200 million in Bitcoin or something. So was that a failure in the mining system to police the network so that something like that couldn't happen?
That's a great question. So the way that that happens is not at a failure of the mining layer one network. The way that the Bitcoin mining network works, it's just basically like code and math. It's like putting through everything in the way that are going to make transactions happen properly. What that's a failure on is whoever's in control of the keys to the wallet, they're the ones that it can be seized. So in many times what we saw with the pipeline and the hackers who were trying to charge and extort money in Bitcoin, what you can do is, if you're the government, is if you go and you follow the wallet addresses of the bad wallets, where you know the hackers are using this wallet and the Bitcoin in here was done for illegal activity, they can contact the exchange, the custodial provider, the actual organization that has control over that wallet, and seize those funds if they so choose to do. So that's when a lot of people have that conversation in crypto where they say, not your keys, not your crypto. You have the ability with Bitcoin to set up your own private keys and to take full responsibility and custody of your crypto. If that's the case, then you're managing your own private keys. There's no bank account or password reset button that you can call, but you have complete control over your wealth. Whereas at a bank, for example, you could go and you could have $1 million in the bank account, but what you're seeing in a lot of other countries and with corrupt regimes, you might not be able to withdraw your money. And so this is the first time where you can go, you can have value in Bitcoin, and you can travel across borders, and you can access that Bitcoin from a fully different location. And you don't have to worry about dealing with banks or other intermediaries to access your funds, because you can take full control. So yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah, someday I want to fully understand Bitcoin, but it's still bit of a mystery to me.
Yeah, it's a very, very early industry. I've got one final question for you guys, but before I ask it, just for everyone listening, could you guys share where everyone listening can connect with you online, and if there are any resources or things that you recommend that they check out to learn more about everything that we've discussed here today and the work that you guys have done, that would be great.
Okay, well, I'll give you my email address is John, John, at solarliving.org. And yeah, that's about, that's the easiest way to contact me. I have a book that I published, the Real Good Solar Living Source Book. I think it's still available on Amazon. If you can't find it, you can get it. It's like 400-page book on history of solar and how solar works and how renewable energy, natural building, pretty much anything for off-the-grid living is in that book. We have another book called Place in the Sun about the history of the Solar Living Center and how it was built, and some ideas on how to build, do natural buildings and do landscapes that are in tune with nature and regenerative agriculture. So those are the two books that I put out. And feel free to contact me via email. Anyone who has any interest in discussing it further.
Yeah, well, my email address is all lowercase, no punctuation, JOHNPERLIN at UCSB for University of California, Santa Barbara .edu. And as I said earlier, my book, which is considered the history of solar energy, is coming out in paperback and answering these questions that we discussed today. You know, how solar is, how we are enduring solar age, is going to part of the book Let It Shine. The 6,000-year story of solar energy, and it will be in paperback in February of next year. Also, my other book, A Forest Journey, The Role of Wood and Civilization, will be coming out in an updated version by Patagonia Books in September of next year.
Right. So the final question for each of you is, how important do you believe it is to begin that transition to a sustainable future with solar energy? And what would you like to leave the listeners with in regards to solar or anything else on the topics we've discussed today?
I would say it's absolutely essential, and hearkening back to my discussion of 1990s when we first began to understand climate change, and the realization that if we didn't do something pretty quickly, things were going to get really bad. I think this summer is really the first indication of that has hit a mass scale, and that if we don't do something immediately, you know, it's pretty much all over for humankind, even though the planet will survive. So I would strongly encourage everyone who hasn't already to eliminate or at least minimize their use of fossil fuels, get an electric vehicle, put solar on your house, and begin to walk your talk a little bit and help cure the ills that are destroying our planet. And on the side note, ruining our democracy, et cetera. I think we need to take a rapid look at ourselves and where we're going and make a sea change immediately, or it'll be way too late. And I've got 5 grandchildren myself, and it just really pains me to think of them growing up in the world. If we don't do something right away to fix things, we're kind of at the very tail end of being able to do something to fix it. And I would just strongly encourage everyone to open up their eyes and think beyond the next 3 months and think about their grandchildren and their children, and get it together once and for all, and listen to Greta Thunberg and the rest of the folks out there that are looking to save the planet.
I just want to say that this has been absolutely incredible. Thank you guys so much for taking the time and talking through these topics. It's very, very important to have these types of discussions and really share what's going on, share views from experts like yourselves.
Thanks, Will, for getting it. We look forward to seeing the final product.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks again, guys. This was a lot of fun.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Take care.